sometimes it's nice when science can make things easier for us, which is not always the case, unfortunately. But in this particular case, the case of heroes, we have a pretty strong idea of exactly where this whole idea of a hero comes from. In the ancient Greek history, there is a lapse, a time where we have no information about what happened. Apparently, some kind of trouble befell on the ancient Greeks, and well, the literature did not keep up with it. However, immediately after that time, there's kind of a renaissance, and that renaissance observes that there are some amazing feats of ancient history that are all over the place. Ancient cities, ancient temples, kind of monumental architecture and statues and whatnot. And these had to be explained somehow via people who had the consciousness of being part of the same civilization, but also apparently did not have a good historical record of what those things are. And in the context of what we have talked about before in this class, this is kind of a pretty cool application of the idea of how the world used to be and how the world is now. And the Greeks at the time had this kind of consciousness of being dislocated from their place at a time where few other people did, although eventually we'll have other parts of that record. The Phoenicians, the Israelites, obviously, will have their own history of displacement by the political happenings in their area. But the same thing happened to the Greeks about 14 centuries before Common Era, where we have these very there's very important traces of an ancient civilization, and yet no good, fair explanation of what they are. And what happens during that time is that this Renaissance, the Mycenaean Age, or the 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 Palace Age of ancient Greece, um, um, writes down their history in terms of literally explaining where what things were and how things happened, and they're trying to make sense of the identity of the people who existed before them. So they start to kind of put up these statues on some sort of a pedestal of explaining those ancient landmarks in terms of this is our great ancient past that we have lost. And this is literally where the myth comes from. So we've talked about this before. Myth is originally a story. This is just something that is told in songs and poems, and that is how it is told by the Greeks anyway. And we have just inherited the word from them. So here an example of Hesiod telling us about the heroic age of Greece. So before the Palace Age or the Mycenaean Age, there is this era of Greek history that the Greeks themselves call the heroic age, the age of heroes. First of all, the deathless gods who dwell on Olympus made a golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos when he was reigning in heaven, and then lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Miserable age rested not on them, but with legs and arms never failing, they made merry with feasting beyond the reach of all levels. When they died, it was as though they were overcome with sleep, and they had all good things, for the fruitful earth enforced them bear them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands and with many good things, rich in flocks and loved by the blessed gods. So there's an ancient time where things were great, things were beautiful, and things were kind of led by the heroes. So these were mortal men born of the gods. So gods that are immortal, but the gods bestow upon us this new race of people who become our heroes, or I guess the heroes of ancient Greece at the time. But you can apply that to any other civilization. In fact, it turns out that we have places that also have other heroes, and as a result of what we learn in Greece, the same kind of template is applied to a heroic age, for example, in Germany. The alliterative, heroic poetry of the Anglo-Saxons is inherited, not important. It is the product of centuries during which the German tribes were educating themselves, making experiments in poetry, among other things, till they gradually formed the established epic type, which in essentials, in style and in phrasing, and even in subject matter, is common to continental Germany and Scandinavia in early times, along with England. It may be compared, even by temperate critics, to the Homeric poetry of Greece, and the comparison need not be misleading. So we have a part of ancient history in Germany, which includes at the time Scandinavia and England, where the literary tradition develops itself around the figures of heroes. And they have these cultural heroes that pop up here and there, although there is no clear history of who they were and how they existed. There is a literary tradition of talking about how great that age was, and it's as a result becomes a heroic age for another place in the world. Some authors, especially today, tend to extend the idea of the heroic age in Germany all the way up until Christianization in the 8th, 10th century, even the 12th and 13th century in Scandinavia. So, oh, and by the way, Frozen, written by Hans Christensen from the Ice Princess, the original book from which Frozen is inspired, happens during that heroic age before the Christianization of Nordic countries. Same person who wrote about mermaids. You get the idea. You're following, I hope. So, of course, the sweeping of Christianization in Germany and in other places changed the world very drastically and changed the traditions, changed the literature, changed everything. And as a result of that, the years that existed before become very romantically attached to some kind of another place and time. Same principles happen to the Tatars in Central Europe, disconnected from most of the other countries that we know, and essentially all the way bordering into Asia. The individualism, which is so salient a feature of the heroic poetry of the Tatars, as of other heroic poetry, is characterized also of the methods of warfare and of the motives for which it is carried on. Of generalship, of strategy, of the art of war, the poems know absolutely nothing. All the fighting of which we have any details is of a personal character, and every battle described at any length resolves itself into a series of single combats in which the heroes of noble birth alone take part. The war between the Serai-no-gai and the Uyghur, so same people who are currently oppressed in China, consists, so at the time they did not live in China, of course, consists of a series of duels between the Manas and Alamanbar and their immediate relatives on the one hand, the Uyghur and the Kalmyk chiefs on the other. These duels are in every respect typical heroic encounters. We see the heroes deliberately discussing before the contest the various methods by which they are about to fight one another and the weapons which they are about to employ. Each hero, vaunting terms, threatens his opponent. So this particular template here is something that you may be familiar by the virtue of watching any kind of movie where you have these people who are fighting the bad guys and then they lay out the plans of exactly how they are going to defeat the odds by fighting the bad guys who are usually better equipped or more scary or whatever it is. So the heroic age in this context is recognized by the achievements. There's no real sense of morals behind it because it's a time of war. It's a time of kind of anything goes, kind of very speculative, and therefore we can't really rely on the context. We can't really rely on even the national consciousness, which doesn't exist yet. This is really about inspiring people to go through the hard times, and this is something that has to be individualized to a certain extent. So the heroic age of the Tatars, of Germany, of Greece, of wherever they are, is kind of allowing us to develop this pretty straightforward account of the culture itself and how you develop a literary form, how you develop a national consciousness, how you develop these kind of characters that today are associated with that. In England, the same principle happens with King Arthur. You may know about King Arthur. You may have had a product made in this particular area of the United States called King Arthur. Well, this is part of a mythology of an ancient time, a time that is fallen for us, but a time that we can still relate to by having some kind of a cultural connection with them. Some 20th century study of the oral poetry of that time kind of tells us that this poetry, this very specific form, would be a little bit less creative than what you would find in myth, because you kind of have a lot more importance in telling the story and inspiring people. So you might not want to have a lot of deviation in the stories, especially if you have those particular characters. There's a lot of importance to keeping the characters within certain bounds so they don't become mythical, so they don't become kind of unbelievable characters, so they can still remain the kind of people that we relate to. And once we meet heroes outside of the European context, the conversation becomes very different, of course, because now we have to make sense of exactly who are these heroes? Are they supernatural or are they not? By the fact that they are doing the supernatural achievements, and certainly Hercules had supernatural achievements, even King Arthur had supernatural achievements. But how do we figure that out in a completely different context, namely the North American context, one place in which we have a pretty lengthy amount of history and documentation? However, in North America, there's no Bronze Age really. There's no ages that we can recognize in the same way that we have in Europe. There's a ceramic age that you can more or less make sense out of. But that's not everywhere around the United States. In other words, different cultures, different indigenous cultures go through different quote unquote ages as a result of that. So, making sense out of these, again, these new periods of history within this new context, within these new technologies is kind of the role of these new studies of myth of the 20th century, especially. Here's an example. Leaving the Ats and the Tinkits, we found Yale, the god or hero of the introduction of the arts, who, like the Christ of the Finnish epic or Maui in New Zealand, was born by a miraculous birth. It, his mother was a Tlingit woman, um, whose boys had all been slain. As she wandered disconsolate by the seashore, a dolphin or whale, taking pity upon her, bade her drink a little salt water and swallow a pebble. She did so, and in due time bore child Yell, the hero of the Tlingit. So, this particular author here, late 19th century, is trying to make sense out of whether this person is a god or a hero. And they have to toe a line, maybe, if you understand what the story is going on to here. You have a mother that gives a miraculous birth out of, well, not sexual intercourse. And this specific hero is kind of going into bringing again, a renaissance to the Tlingit culture. Now, how do we make sense out of this in terms of, is this too close to the biblical story for us to be comfortable with? Or is it just part of the fact that this is just the mythical story here? Perhaps, again, looking at it from the form of a natural explanation. So here we have a dolphin or whale that is giving this person salt water. And so the nature of living on the Pacific Northwest coast is such that this is a believable interpretation, but it is obviously different from the life of people living in a desert and living in a desert in a different time in Palestine. So, trying to make sense out of this, whether this is a form of a myth, kind of a mythical form that exists everywhere, or is it just a form of a myth that is based on this naturalistic expression? So people will see some stuff that is happening in nature and make sense out of it as nature. Maybe this is part of a ritual explanation. It's not exactly clear, but essentially, we're not running out of heroes out here. More specifically, in this context, we have the development of an idea such as the culture heroes. Franz Boas of course, the father of American anthropology, kind of brought a pretty big conversation around this idea of the culture heroes, and especially connecting it in the American Indian tradition to what he calls the tricksters. Tricksters are a very common form found in these Native American myths all the way around the United States and Canada and Northern and Central America as well. So, and certainly South America too, but no, Boaz did not go there. So this character of the trickster is something that Boaz characterizes as a hero. The story of the so-called culture hero who gave the world its present shape, who killed monsters that infected the land, and gave man the arts that make life worth living, is one of the most widely distributed Indian myths. In what we might call the prehistoric era, there was no clear distinction between man and animals. At last, the culture hero appeared and transformed some of the beings in those times into animals and others into men. He taught the latter how to kill animals, how to make fires, and how to clothe themselves. He is the great benevolent being, the helper of mankind. But the same great culture hero appears in other groups of tales as a slight trickster who vaingloriously thinks himself superior to all other beings, whom he tries to deceive in all sorts of ways, and who is often punished for his presumption by the superior powers of his proposed victims. So the trickster kind of throws a wrench into the whole idea of connecting this to a biblical story, because if you have the same possibility of a character that exists in the stories, but that is not necessarily the winner in the end, so this particular culture hero creates a change in the culture itself and can perhaps sometimes even gives the culture its name, but they are not necessarily rewarded for it. They turn out to be some kind of an anti-hero. Now, sure, you could make the argument that Jesus Christ dies in the Bible, and that is certainly part of the story. Is that the story does not end well for Jesus Christ, but it is also a story where, well, he comes back and he lives to be forever, which is obviously not the case here for the tricksters. Tricksters are so called because they are going through this transformational phases. The most common form of the trickster in indigenous cultures is called coyote. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But tricksters are also sometimes called, as a result, transformers because they are changing shapes. So they could be also shapeshifters, if you will. This introduction to Transformer Tales by Boaz once again. Or so Transformer, culture hero, tricksters are all the same. Like the introductory parts of the Raven myth, those of the Transformer or culture hero tales show considerable variation. Among the Quackioto, the Transformer is called, I'm not going to pronounce the name, and his brother are sent down from heaven and are adopted by Hero and his wife, the Woodpecker, who own a salmon weir. So we have Raven, Heron, and Woodpecker, birds, of course. Whenever the latter come home with salmon, they shout, "Enemies are coming." The children discover this and kill and transform the old people. So Boaz here is kind of gathering a bunch of these cultural hero tales and talking about how they establish this aspect of transition. They themselves being transitional characters, transforming characters, are also transforming us, transforming the culture as a result of that. So they, by going through one shape to the other, and again, right, you can make the same argument. Jesus Christ has the transmogrification, transform water into wine, and his body is the bread and whatnot. I mean, figure that out in your own mythical stories here. But the ideas are of this changing times and this going out of these troubled times into the modern era of some sort or another. I'd like to add one last form of a trickster that you may be aware of, because, of course, if you are thinking of it as a cultural hero, if you think of those different cultural heroes as these important characters in the mythical stories, it is very easy to connect the idea of Jesus to being a cultural hero. It's not necessarily wrong, and there's certainly a pretty good argument to be made for it, especially in the context of Jewish cultures. heroes because Christianity came out of a sect of Judaism after a time of dreadful political and human troubles, and it is quite possible that the figure of Jesus Christ came up as a culture hero within some Jewish traditions and not others. Certainly, Jewish tradition has its own heroes, and of course, Abraham and Moses and the such, but eventually they are supplanted by a new hero, a new form, perhaps because of the new troubles that they are going through. So perhaps it is a part of a shared ancient history that all people at some point were living this prehistoric life and eventually develop culture, maybe because it's a sense of animism, as Taylor pointed out, where people have this idea of putting souls into things, and as a result of that, create these animistic slash religious traditions. Perhaps this is how polytheism is made now that you have a bunch of cultural heroes that exist and they are more or less able to live with one another. Or because it's a matter of our understanding of humans as a part of the animal world, more or less separated from it. The idea of the culture hero in that context becomes very wide, and especially so this is in German, as you probably noticed. But the Breisig, a German philosopher slash mythologian, brings all of these stories together in the European context. So outside of what we talked about with Boaz, uh, um, um, Breisig points out to the existence of cultural heroes in Europe and around the world, including Jesus as the cultural hero. Although the culture hero in this context is he's what he called Heilbringer or Heiland or Seelingmacher, that is a savior, a bringer of salvation, a redeemer, kind of a much broader idea, much more connected to ideas of Christianity. So, any way you want to see how those cultural hero works, they help us as a point of reference to the world that we have, to the world that we once had, and maybe to the worlds that might come later.